Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you very much for coming here today. And on behalf of the Cordoba Foundation and the Guernica Group, I welcome you all. My name is Anas El Tikriti, and I am the CEO and founder of the Cordoba Foundation. I have to start off by offering my personal thanks and gratitude to our partners today, the Guernica Group, whom worked so tirelessly over the course of the past few months on compiling quite an extensive report, the launch of which we are here to hear about. I hope that you have all gotten your copy of the executive summary, 12 pages that summarize the most important parts of the 300-page almost report, which you can download from our website, thecordobafoundation.com. I also, and before I introduce our panel for today, I have to afford also my thanks and gratitude to the person who actually organized this particular launch, Dr. Abdullah Faliq, the director of the Cordoba Foundation, and his team of volunteers. And also I'd like to welcome our friends from the media today. Now, coming to the reports, and I think it's quite important to draw a context as to why it is that we found it fitting to publish this report addressing the status of the Egyptian judiciary. This report comes in as a direct response to a report published almost 14 to 15 months ago, or probably even earlier than that, by 9 Bedford Row, a reputable, well-known legal entity that operates from here in London. It is no longer, I believe, a secret or unknown that 9 Bedford Row have acted on behalf of their clients, who are essentially the Egyptian government, the Egyptian regime. And the report that they published about the how shall I put it, the almost perfect nature of Egypt's judiciary under General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was the third and last in a series of 3 reports in which they attempted to essentially whitewash what is now effectively known and internationally recognized as being a coup that was carried out against Egypt's fledgling democracy in July of 2013, after which one of the worst massacres seen in modern times took place in Rabaa Square in August of 2013. And since then, a serious concerning descent into chaos, into lawlessness, and a state of utter oppression, the like of which Egypt has seldom known in recent times. So the Cordoba Foundation found fit to respond to each of those reports, of those 3 reports, one after the other. And indeed, about a year and a half ago, many of you might have joined us in the launch of the earlier 2 reports, which can also be found on our website. And this, we thought, that needed a little bit more time, a little bit more research, and indeed, in the hands of our colleagues from the Guernica Group, we knew that this was going to be a report that was not only well thought out, but immaculately carried out. And therefore, we have this report that amounts to 279 pages, answering and responding to the 9 Bedford Row report point by point, and also illustrating and outlining many of the points that our colleagues and friends that you'll hear from today thought pertinent. With that, I will now hand over to our panel, and the order of what we're going to do today is I am going to firstly invite Carl Buckley, who's the director of the chambers at Guernica 37, and who's a barrister with an established international practice specializing in the UN system of protection and the investigation of international human rights violations. So I'm going to ask Carl, who was one of the main authors of the report, to give a few minutes summarizing what he found and wrote down, and what you will find within the pages of the report. After which I'm going to ask Ibrahim Halawa, who's our guest visiting London all the way from Dublin today. And Ibrahim, for those of you who don't already know, he is an Egyptian Irishman who in 2013 found himself foul of the very system, the very judicial system that today we are addressing, and spent over 4 years in prison and was released after an international campaign, which I personally saw a protest raising the image and the cause of Ibrahim Halawa in Chicago several years ago, I have to say. So gladly he's now here with us. He's an eyewitness to what is happening inside the prison cells and the judiciary system in Egypt. So he'll be speaking next. And then I'm going to be inviting Drury Dyke, who's a research fellow at the Foreign Policy Center. He was a researcher for Amnesty International between 1999 and 2017 and has led work on Afghanistan and the Middle East, and has contributed to other projects, including with regarding Minority Rights Group and Transparency International. He'll be speaking to us after that. And finally, but last and not least, our friend and colleague Toby Cadman, who's a barrister, and he's the co-founder and head of Guernica 37, International Justice Chambers in London. He specializes in international law and the pursuit of justice through international accountability mechanisms, such as the ICC, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the ICTV, and the Bosnian War Crimes Chamber. So as you all realize, we have an illustrious panel, and I'm extremely pleased to introduce them all one by one to you today. So without further ado,
Anas,
over to you, Carl.
Before you start, I just
Yes.
want to make one remark.
Of course, yes, absolutely. Toby.
Before we start with the presentation of the report and the hearing from the individual speakers, I think it's important for me to make a disclosure. Many of you may know that I used to be a barrister at 9 Bedford Row International. I never worked on behalf of the CC regime in the preparation of the reports by 9 Bedford Row. I worked exclusively on these reports, responding to those. But as many of you will know, barristers in chambers are very different to law firms and firms of solicitors, when quite frequently we work on different sides of the same matter from the same chambers. I thought it was important that that is made known, that I was formerly a member of 9 Bedford Row. I formed Guernica 37 close to 2 years ago, and certainly had no involvement with the preparation of the reports by 9 Bedford Row.
Thank you very much, Toby. I think that was very important. Thank you. So over to you, Carl.
Thank you. You will forgive me for being somewhat brief, simply because it's nigh on impossible to condense 297 pages into a 10-minute piece. So this presentation is more of the edited highlights and the salient themes that run throughout the report. As Anas quite correctly points out, this report is a direct response to that which was commissioned by the Egyptian State Litigation Authority. Now, Egypt would suggest to the international community that there is no cause for concern. Egypt quite properly respects an individual's fair trial rights, and Egypt is a democracy and its citizens enjoy the relevant rights and freedoms that are associated to it. The reality, of course, is that the opposite is true. One of the very central pillars of any democracy in any country, a pillar upon which democracy is built, is that of the rule of law. Without respect for the rule of law and its principles, then it cannot be said that democracy exists. Egypt isn't free, it isn't fair, there isn't full respect for fundamental rights and freedoms, and there's certainly not respect for those rights and freedoms that us sitting here in the UK would take for granted and we just enjoy as of right. That which is espoused by the Sisi government, therefore, is at best simply rhetoric and propaganda in an effort to convince the world that what it is doing is appropriate. The only objective conclusion to be drawn is that Egypt has no respect for the rule of law. The entire justice system has been manipulated and perhaps the best word to describe it is weaponized. It enables now the government to further its grasp on power. It enables it to crack down on what it suggests to be threats to national security, but they aren't a threat to national security. What it terms as threats are actually citizens simply seeking to exercise their right to free speech, their right to free expression, their right to free association, to name but three. And perhaps what's more concerning is the fact that traditionally, if we look historically at the Egyptian justice system, it was seen as one to be replicated years and decades ago. Numerous Middle Eastern jurisdictions, such as the pre-dictatorship systems in Libya and in Iraq, have turned to Egypt as a source for their own laws. And even today, the civil code of many Arab nations is based in part or in its majority on the previous Egyptian civil code. So Egypt has an illustrious history as far as its judicial system is concerned. That has effectively been taken down piece by piece. And in drafting this report and in speaking to you this evening, I fully accept that within the Egyptian justice system, there are relevant protections woven into it. If you read the Egyptian constitution and its criminal code, there are guarantees as far as fair trial rights are concerned of an individual, and there are due process guarantees contained within it. So on a purely academic consideration of the relevant law, then we could say that the system is appropriate because of what is there within its statutory authority. And this is perhaps strengthened when we look at Chapter 3 of the report that deals with Egypt being a state party to a number of different international treaties that seek to guarantee various rights. So we see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and its succession in 1986 to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment would suggest that on the face of it, Egypt can demonstrate a commitment to fair trial rights. However, we have to start looking a little deeper. The first point, Egypt has thus far failed to sign any of the optional protocols to those treaties, optional protocols that give an individual the right to take a complaint to the UN system of protection and the relevant special rapporteurs. So it is explicitly preventing citizens from taking complaints internationally. Similarly, Egypt has failed to become a state party to the International Convention for Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. So again, it is seeking to prevent rights from being exercised. As well as these UN treaties, we have Egypt being a member of the African Union. Accordingly, it's bound by that constitutive act of union, in particular Article 4, which guarantees respect for democratic principles, human rights, the rule of law, and good governance. So again, you could be forgiven for concluding that there is a commitment being demonstrated. But when we, as I say, when we look deeper, it all starts to unravel. So we take the Egyptian judiciary as one example. Again, it's essential that in any justice system that the judiciary is fiercely independent, so that it is free from influence, that it is free from manipulation, and it judges cases accordingly. Egypt's simply isn't. In September 2016, the International Commission of Jurists published its own 156-page report with a detailed analysis of the Egyptian judiciary and its functioning. Its conclusion, amongst others, was that the government is using the judiciary as a tool of political repression. And that is a prime example of what happens in any dictatorship. And let's be quite clear on the matter. Egypt is not a democracy. It is a dictatorship being run by President Sisi. And we see this time and time again in many different states. that a dictator will take control of the judiciary because it allows it to become weaponized. It allows the judiciary to be used as a tool of political oppression by prosecuting and imprisoning individuals who seek to exercise their freedom. Now, this report may have been written in September 2016, but we cannot say that the position has changed at all in the last 2 years, and therefore that conclusion is still relevant today. An individual's right to a fair trial, as another example, ought to be guaranteed regardless of the state that we were dealing with. Article 10 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights recognises and guarantees this right. Article 14 of the International Covenant recognises and guarantees this right, and also seeks to develop it further by highlighting associated rights with the fair trial, the presumption of innocence, the right to communication with counsel of an individual's own choosing, the right to be defended by counsel of an individual's own choosing, and the principle of equality of arms, for example. And again, Article 7 of the African Charter follows these principles. So we can see Egypt in the middle, surrounded by these international treaties that it purports to adhere to that guarantee these rights. Domestically, the 2014 Constitution, the Code of Criminal Procedure and the Criminal Code, and even the Judicial Authority Law, all seek to guarantee fair trial standards. But again, to refer to previous reports that have been published, proceedings have been, and to quote, have been marred by a litany of violations of international recognised rights. We can only conclude that given the degree of unfairness and arbitrariness of the judicial process in Egypt and the number and gravity of due process violations that we see consistently, again, the only logical objective conclusion that can be drawn is that the right to a fair trial has all but been dispensed with as far as the Egyptian system is concerned. There is a complete lack of impartiality within the courts, a complete lack of judicial independence, and this is coupled with a significant number of politically motivated trial where defendants are deprived of their most basic procedural rights. We now need to consider the case of Shor Khan to see that matters are politically motivated. Shor Khan is a photographer. He was taking pictures at Rabba Square. That was all he was doing. Shor Khan has spent 4 years in pre-trial detention. His life is now in serious danger as far as his treatment and his position. There is absolutely no justification for his detention in the first instance. But in any event, he can only be detained for 2 years under the Egyptian constitution pre-trial anyway, and therefore he is detained for double the legally allowed amount of time. Again, politically motivated processes that withdraw all procedural and due process protections. Now, to its credit, the most recent State Litigation Authority report does acknowledge that there have on occasion been occasional breaches of fair trial rights. But it goes on to say that because of the complex situation in Egypt, the situation must be assessed on a case-by-case basis. With respect to that report and its authors, that is entirely incorrect and has absolutely no basis. The report goes on to suggest that there have been cases where irregularities have been corrected on appeal. And again, that is correct. There are instances where irregularities have been corrected. But they suggest that that is evidence of the system is functioning as it should. No, it isn't. It is evidence that on a minority of occasions an appeal has been successful. It is not indicative of the wider process in Egypt. The fact remains that simply because an appeal has been successful, that does not legitimise an otherwise illegitimate process. It simply means that one mistake has been corrected. It doesn't correct the mistake for the over 40,000 civilians that have been detained for no reason. And again, those appeals do not justify what has happened in other cases. It doesn't justify the use of soundproof, opaque cages in which defendants are held during the trial process. it doesn't justify those other measures that are taken to prevent a defendant from taking an active part in his defence. It doesn't justify the fact that defendants are explicitly prevented from speaking to counsel that they may seek to instruct for them. Nor does it justify the trial of over 300 individuals in one morning of one day, guilty verdicts being returned and death sentence being imposed on the vast majority of those 300. Now, with just that one example, how can we say that the justice system is functioning correctly? The reality of the matter is that no matter the rhetoric and the propaganda being espoused by the government of Egypt and that which is occurring in Egypt currently, and specifically the breakdown in the rule of law, none of it can be justified or defended. The lack of investigation into Rabba cannot be defended. As Anas has referred to, it is one of the worst massacres in modern times, and yet no investigation and no one has faced prosecution. As I've already alluded to, the case of Shorkan cannot be defended. 4 years pre-trial detention for merely taking photographs as per his position as a photographic journalist. The treatment of former President Morsi cannot be defended. He is prevented from speaking to counsel instructed. He is prevented from speaking in court. He is prevented from viewing prosecution evidence. And again, his health has suffered and his life is in danger as a result of that which he is forced to endure. None of that can be justified. The only conclusion that can be objectively drawn, and the summary that you've already been provided with alludes to this, but I would suggest that it would become even clearer from considering the entire report, is that the only conclusion that can be objectively drawn is that the rule of law in Egypt has broken down almost entirely. And the only reason I say almost is because courts still exist. They do not function as they should by any stretch, but they are there. Therefore, there is still a system. As a consequence of this breakdown in the rule of law, it cannot be said that democracy exists. It does not. I would urge you all to read the report, and then you will get a better understanding of what I've tried to run through very quickly over these past few minutes. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. I wish to reiterate what Carl said there at the end. The report is, I mean, I'm someone who has a very low threshold when it comes to legalese, to legal jargon and legal reports of the such. But I have to say that this report is easy to read. It's, dare I say, a page turner almost, but it is quite, it's written in language that is accessible, it's very, very clear. And I think that that's to the credit of the authors. And Carl, thank you very, very much for that, as well as for what you've just said over the course of the past few minutes. Now, I also have to say that it's an absolute delight that for once we're talking about a judiciary that is drowning in corruption and politicization, and yet we are today privileged to be able to hear from someone who actually was a victim of that same system. Usually we're talking about people whom we have no access to, we can't reach, we can't speak to. But thankfully with us today is Ibrahim Halawa, who spent just over 4 years in prison. And I'd like in the course of the next 10 minutes or so for Ibrahim to sort of give us some sort of insight of what it is like in an Egyptian court and obviously subsequently in an Egyptian prison.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all coming, all of you today to hear me. I deeply apologize because I've got very sad news yesterday, so I'm not in the happiest mood about one of the guys that was behind bars. Of course, I'm an Irish-born citizen, and I've lived in Ireland my whole life. I went to Egypt as a summer holiday in 2013 with my family, and as a result, we seen the injustice happen in Egypt, and we took part. And of course, after it, when we seen the Rab'a massacre, we decided that this is inhumane, and we need to take actions upon our democratic background that we come from. I'm not going to get too much detailed into prison because there is a lot of reports about this, but since I've got that depressing news, I've wrote once a letter to my inmates that I was with them at once, and I'm going to read it out if that's okay. Of course, you know, the judicial system, there is many reports about it. Of course, the juvenile imprisonment as well. Reprieve have written, I've written a foreword for Reprieve about their report on juvenile imprisonment, which is very important, as well as this report. And all of this pours into one glass that we need to, raise awareness and put political pressure on Egypt, on what's happening there, of course. The judicial system, briefly speaking, because you have requested this from me, Dr. Enes. 4 years we have not spoken to a judge. 4 years we are not presented in front of any judge. Every judge that would come, he will announce the case and leave it and let go of the case and pass it on to another judge, because clearly they've known that there was no case. Many of our inmates from the same case have died because of lack of medication, and of course some have died from torture. There is reports on them as well that have been written down. Also, we were not allowed to speak to lawyers. The first time I have spoken to a lawyer was after 3 years. The trial was with 494 people. It's Al-Fath trial. We were presented after 4 years in front of a judge who did not hear us properly, who did not give us a fair trial. There was no witnesses, there was no evidence, and yet a lot of people, most of the trial was sentenced to 25 years and 15 years after we were meant to, our charges were that we were facing the death penalty. Of course, I was arrested as a 17-year-old, which was illegal by the Egyptian law. My sisters also were arrested and beaten, and we were all beaten and tortured. They were released after 3 months back to Ireland, and I remained for the next 4 years. I was, Amnesty has fought for my behind in a lot of campaigns, like we have spoken about, the UN and the European Parliament, and yet there was no release on that state. Of course, a lot of this political pressure not needs to be done by me, but a lot needs to be done by you. They look at me as a prisoner, but they look at you as the people of truth. And I always tell this to the people of Ireland, that since they have become aware of the Egyptian case, that we need to spread it more. And we need to put a lot of hope into the people who are fighting to live like we are living today. I'm just going to read this quickly, if that's okay. So usually when I was in prison, I would write letters and poems to the outside to make the people know what life is like on the other side. What suffering we would go through for a simple right that should not be taken away from us by power. A simple right that some may take for granted every single day, and others are willing to die for. The right for democracy and freedom of speech. Some of you may read my letter I wrote called I am sorry it has been 3 years. I wrote this letter while I passed the 3 years mark in prison, to my family and my friends and to the Irish people. But this time I'm going to send a letter to those who are still left behind bars, still detained today unjustly. To those who I have built a human bond, built on nothing but sacrifice and love for one another. Some of which I have spent 24/7, a lot of which have become family to me. Today it's nearly over 7 months since I have been released. Seven painful months since I have walked out that cell. I have counted every minute and every second. With every breath I'm grateful for my freedom. But for some reason my breath feels heavy, like it's a pile of bricks on my chest. Not a day goes by. I remember you all. I think about you with everything in freedom I cherish. Every day I feel haunted by freedom, haunted by the light that feels like darkness. Do you remember the nights we would stay up imagining how the world is such a beautiful place outside? That how the future must have become a brighter place? That no flaw in the world would be as bad as the situation we are living? Remember how we always thought we are writing history, and that we are the people's shield for them to live in the future, in order for the world to become a better place? Or those days we would draw on the walls of the cell just so one day when freedom has decided to knock down those big walls that our names would be engraved on the walls for the people to see. Well, let me tell you how it is from the other side. How the world has become a bed for the wrongdoers, and the ones who fight for the good cause are the criminals of this time. That the dreams we are dreaming, not for us but for the generations to come, are now somehow nightmares. That thinking about another human you have not met yet is now a big sin. People have all become scared by being eaten by other people. Stopping someone in the streets now is not for the sake of saluting them or saying hello, but to point out their flaws. People are scared of giving their opinion because they will be taken down. It has become so normal for some people to see people in need and not help them, or even see the homeless on the street and not stop by and ask them if they are okay, or see a crime happen and not stop by it. But with a lot of good in people is why I'm writing you this letter today. It's why I'm on the other side now, praying every day that one day you all become free, trying everything within my willpower to get you all released. But till then, I think of you every day. I have not forgotten any of you. I feel like I'm still dreaming in the outside world, that I will wake up between you all in the cell, because believe me when I say that 4 years gap has made me feel like a stranger between this world. That a lot see me as a hero when I really don't understand how I'm being called a hero, when I fought for a good cause yet to come out and find the world a darker place. But they always say the moon wouldn't shine if it wasn't as dark around it. I always look at the moon and remember how we would see it from behind wires and bars, and how it was tiny and yet it would beam light into our dark cells. As we always knew that one day hope will still be out there waiting for us. I'm sorry it has taken me this long to write a letter, as I feel ashamed that I was released and you all remain behind bars. I'm sorry I wasted so much time trying to justify to people what they have taught me in the first place, and standing up for another human being in need is not a crime. I'm sorry that I have not lived up for the expectations you all saw in me walking out that cell, shouting, "Ibrahim, please do not forget us." The desperation in it ringing in my brain every day, it reminds me of how desperate I once was. I'm sorry that every day I can open my door and set foot outside without getting beaten. I'm sorry that now I'm in between my family, and every day at every gathering we sit and laugh while I cry from the inside, because I remembered how we all wish to see our families for at least half an hour a week. I'm sorry that I can see my nieces and nephews grow, when most of you can't even see your own kids grow. That you won't have the memories to tell your children of how they were when they were kids. I'm sorry I can eat clean food and drink clean water. I'm sorry I can shower in a clean shower. I'm sorry that every time I miss my family, I can pick up the phone and joke with them to make sure that they're still okay. I'm sorry that my words are taking this long to do you justice. I'm sorry that I put my head on the pillow and I would sleep, and the last thing would be on my mind will be you, but yet I fall asleep on a pillow. I'm sorry I have a bed I can sleep on every night and feel the warmth during the cold winter, the cell was in during this time. Of course, it's not as cold here, but it's cold. I'm sorry that I can't be there to defend you from the oppressor that would torture you. I'm sorry I can't make you all laugh and tell you the stories about Ireland and how safe it is, and that we are just one big family. And I would see the tears in your eyes, hoping that one day you can live in an environment like that. But I will never be sorry for talking about you to any person I see. Maybe one day they could be the change for your oppression. I will never forget how we would take turns standing on each other's shoulders just to smell some air from outside, and we used to call it free air. And we hated breathing the air that was keeping us alive in the cell, the air that was imprisoned with us. Perhaps that is why I feel the tightness in my breath. As I always said, they may imprison my body and not my soul, but only when I was released is how much I realized that they have released my body and not my soul, because my soul remains incarcerated where you remain. Because one day we will be able to live free together. Maybe one day we will be able to smell the free air. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I don't have the words to respond. I thank you for sharing those words with everyone. I move on to Drury. Drury, thank you very much for joining us today. And I mean, from what we've heard both Carl's take on the report, outlining the case that the report tries to press in terms of the situation of the judiciary in Egypt. And then we've heard from someone who was a victim firsthand with dealing with what we're talking about. What can be done in light of this report what is it that people can take away from the report in order to create some form of change. I'll hand over to you, and you can take it from there.
Thanks, Ennis. I don't know if I can address straight on those comments, except to say that the reports, Courts in Chaos certainly is a massive contribution to the discourse, and I think in part what we should be doing in respect to combating what is a tragic situation in Egypt, a country of which I'm not an expert by any means. But as I read this report, and indeed the reports which it is a rebuttal of, the Egyptian courts and challenges, what struck me was precisely the kind of thing that sadly we've just heard from Ibrahim, and actually the reason why I wanted to be here today as well, and that's the story of people. As you heard from Carl at the very beginning, the Courts in Chaos is a rebuttal. It's a point-by-point rebuttal in places, point-by-point, of the Egypt courts and some recent challenges reports. The two of them draw on very similar human rights backgrounds, the international legal framework and so on. Carl referred to the ICCPR, the various treaties to which Egypt is a state party. And indeed, he does refer to, and both reports refer to how those fair trial guarantees are in the report. But that's where the Courts and Challenges report from 9 Bedford Road International and this report, Court in Chaos, that's where they part company. They part company on the basis of cases, the plethora, scores, hundreds of cases. And if for no other reason, read that, read those. And more to the point, a lot of those cases are drawn from reputable international bodies such as the UN, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances. The Chapter 3 and some recent challenges on fairness of trials, I have to say, it compares very unfavorably to Chapter 5 in Court in Chaos, again, because of the chaos. The Chapter 6 on arrest and detention in Court in Challenges is faced down by the same opposite number, Chapter 6 in the report that's being launched today, because of the use of cases. And behind those cases, there are people. And that's what I think is really striking about Ibrahim's words today. I'm not a specialist on Egypt, but I guess the thing which really struck me as incredibly powerful about this report are just two things really struck me. Was the use of military courts. Now, the report sets out how the use of ordinary courts, what are termed ordinary courts, is flawed, deeply flawed. Ibrahim referred to some of the experiences he had. Carl referred to some of the cases where people were not brought to be able to challenge the detention orders and so on, arbitrary arrest. But it was the military courts and in the impunity enjoyed by the authorities that really struck me. And what's behind it? And I guess this is where it gets difficult, is because the number, hundreds of people who died in custody from 2011 onward is, I'm sorry to use the word, it's gobsmacking. Look, the Egypt Courts and Challenges by 9 Bedford Road International, in all due respect to the chambers, and I'm sure they did a great job in fulfilling what was called upon of them by the employees. It's an apology. It serves as an apology. It's kind of like, come on, world, Muslim Brotherhood's really, really bad. They're really, really dangerous. Give us some slack. But then if you go on to read just some of the core chapters of Court in Chaos, you see, no, it's just not on. It's just not humane to have that many people detained arbitrarily, to have died in custody for those for the number of violations to have taken place, and yet to offer up such a small number of those who've been put on trial in connection with their violations. And I wanted to sort of get below, understand, as a non-specialist in Egypt, what underpins this structure? Why is it like this? How is this supported? And Egypt Courts and Challenges, it doesn't address that, I guess, obviously. But, and again, I think Carl referred to this as well, Court in Chaos does, in respect to the system of appointment, and it's one of the things that he drew attention to in his talk as well, but how the judiciary has been kind of co-opted, used as a tool of political repression, and indeed other international organizations have referred to it. And what I'm left with thinking is that it's a system which is now bereft of legitimacy. And I guess that's deeply worrying as somebody who's worked in the human rights field, is that when the judicial system, fair trial and so on, loses its legitimacy, and again, it's something that Carl referred to, the overarching structure under which it rests also is compromised. So it brings you on to the next question, so who's going to blink? What's going to change? How is this going to unravel? And it's impossible to say, obviously. But I guess the immediate thing is, this report's not going to make, sadly, it's not going to make the Sisi government change overnight. It just isn't. Nor are the countless numbers of UN documents and other human rights organizations. Actually, just this week, Human Rights Watch issued a report on almost precisely the same thing in respect to fair trials. So this is not unplowed territory. And for me, the kind of elephant in the room in the reports is the technological race. It's this race about how technology was used. And I remember 2011, about how some people were saying, okay, in January 2011, Facebook and Al Jazeera and so on helped accelerate the changes in Egypt at that time. And I guess I do wonder now, and it seems to me that the people are ahead of the government in this respect. It's the use of WhatsApp and Telegram and so on, and that the legitimacy of the government itself is in question. It's at play. It's at play by the people who have got expectations, who do want more. And I just want to close with the reason why I want to take part in this tonight. And having heard that Ibrahim was detained for 4 years, it's a lot less to say that a very dear friend of mine's wife, Mohammed Lutfi, who's a former colleague of mine at Amnesty International. He's the executive director of the Egyptian Commission on Rights and Freedoms. So his wife had a rough day in May of 2011. She was groped on a bus, took a taxi home. I think faced a sexist comment by a taxi driver and so on, and got home and did a short video about how things were basically not very nice, and that a lot of people in Egypt, or men in officialdom, were sexist. And she posted it, and it kind of got a lot of viewers. And in May 2018, sorry, and of course we're only now in July, she was detained. And I kind of feel, from the little that I know of Ibrahim's case, it's actually not dissimilar. She made a video complaining about sexism and the position of women in society. The litany of things is what happened. The doorman was beaten when they tried to when they finally went out. When her and her husband finally went out and saw that he had been beaten, he had an arrest. He claimed to have an arrest warrant, which he didn't show. How they treated them as a couple vis-a-vis a 3-year-old child. In fact, it was a non-violent expression of a conscientiously held belief. Held in Mahdi, bring it up to date. Look, she's still held. There's 2 cases that she's facing. One is in relation to the Mahdi, a misdemeanor case, and a state security case brought against her in respect to membership of a terrorist organization, use of the internet to promote promote beliefs that promote terrorism itself, themselves, spread false rumors and in respect to public order. So, I mean, it's a bit galling to say this while Ibrahim and others who may have similar experiences are here. But if anything, I would like to do tonight is devote my talk, my intervention, and indeed the work that these gentlemen have put into this report to Amal Fati, who is detained at this time for having done absolutely nothing. And it shows that there's not only Muslim Brotherhood people who have been caught up in Sisi's jails, but all sorts of people. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Drury. Thank you very much. And last but not least, over to Toby Cadman. And again, Toby, if I may come back to the report itself. You spent over a year and 4 or 5 months poring over information, sources, news, testimonies, and the such. And ultimately, yourself and Carl produced this fantastic work. If you were to outline the main findings of the report, what would they be?
Well, I would say read the report and you'll see them. I think one of the important points to make is that when we first discussed it, we felt as though we could respond to the original report in 1 page. We could discredit, disprove all of the assertions in the first report in 1 page. But I think it was important, and as Drury has said, what he takes from the report is the use of cases. And so what we looked at was primarily the assertions that they're making, that everything is fine. They are a state party to a number of international treaties and conventions, and these are being applied in the domestic context. And they are not. As far as the military regime is concerned, these are pieces of paper that they've signed up to, but there is no practical implementation of any of these rights. And the one point that Carl made, and that we set out in some detail in the report, is that the report by the Egyptian regime was very much based on you have to understand the context, you have to understand the difficulty situation that Egypt now finds itself. But let's not forget what they're talking about is undermining, limiting, and removing what are absolute rights that cannot be limited, restricted, or removed, even in terms of national emergency or conflict. When we talk about fair trial rights, when we talk about the prohibition on torture, I mean, these are fundamental, absolute rights. And it was very, very important to set that out in some detail. But it was also important to look at how the judiciary, as Carl has said, was once a shining light in the Middle East and North Africa, that has been hijacked by the military regime. And as Carl has quite rightly said, that this is a tool of oppression, a tool of repression that autocratic states use. In all of the conflicts that we see, in all of the situations where democracy has been removed, where any voice of opposition has been marginalized, you will see that the autocratic or the dictatorship will use the courts as a way to target political opponents. And quite often we say you don't need to kill people on the streets anymore when you can use the state security apparatus and you can use the courts. Now, of course, Egypt has also killed people on the streets, so let's not forget that. And as we've heard, tens of thousands have been detained, have been tortured. Foreign nationals have been detained, tortured, and in one case with the Italian PhD student who was tortured and killed in Egypt. You had the case of Shokan, who we have had the pleasure to represent. We've obviously not been able to meet him because we can't get into Egypt, but we were able to secure a powerful ruling from the UN Working Group on arbitrary detention. He was also declared a prisoner of conscience by the US Congressional Tom Lantis Human Rights Commission. He has received awards for what he has done and what he's going through. And what we've seen recently when he received an award from UNESCO, his treatment deteriorated. He was punished for having international recognition. And so when dealing with cases such as these and dealing with campaigns, you have to be very, very careful that you're not actually making the situation even worse for these individuals. But you have to set out what has happened repeatedly, how prosecutors, judges, law enforcement, state security services are following a common theme, a common line. It is a plan. It is widespread, systematic, by the state apparatus that we have said repeatedly constitutes the crime under the Rome Statute of crimes against humanity. I mean, it is of that level. One of the questions that was asked of me before I came in is, why can we not take this to the International Criminal Court? Well, there is no jurisdiction. Egypt has not ratified the Rome Statute, as they have not ratified the optional protocols for a number of other human rights treaties. As Carl has quite rightly said, they have ratified the ICCPR and various other treaties, but they remove the right of individuals to take their cases to the various different committees and special procedures. So by addressing all of these concerns, you have to address them point by point by saying the rights exist in theory. They do not exist in practice. Individuals are taken into custody. They are beaten. They are held in solitary confinement. If they do anything to displease the authorities, their conditions of detention deteriorate. They are not given access to lawyers. They are not given access to their families. They do not see judges for 3 years. And we have to look upon this in that we are privileged, and we can complain about the political system that we live in this country, but we are privileged in the sense that we have a judicial system that we can turn to. And if we complain and we demonstrate, we're not going to be shot on the streets, we're not going to be arrested and held in a hellhole for years on end. And going back to the case of Shorkan, the prosecutor has now requested the death penalty in his case, as with all of the others that he's detained with. So, we have to recognize how fortunate we are to live in this country, and to live in a country where we do have democracy, we do have an independent and impartial functioning judicial system, and we have a way of addressing any concerns that we may have as to how we've been treated, or family members who have been arrested and treated. There is that system. So it is important to set out, and I think what I would recommend is, as painful as I appreciate it will be to read 280 odd pages.
It won't be painful.
Not nearly as painful as it was to write it, but it's important to also read it after having read the first report by 9 Bedford Row International. I think it's important to read that and to see what arguments they set out and how we respond to them.
Thank you very much, Toby. Thank you. I think that we've sort of covered the report from the legal perspective, from the contextual angle in terms of it being a response to another report. Drury, I think, did quite well in terms of comparing various elements that were in the original 9 Bedford Row report and this. We heard, of course, from Ibrahim, someone who was a victim of the very same system that we're talking about today. Just before I hand over the discussion to yourselves for any remarks or any comments or questions to the panel, I'd just like to remind everyone that this report does make for a gruesome reading, not just because of the the vast number of pages, but because of what's within those pages. The cases that the report alludes to and mentions are very, very painful. But remarkably, we're not talking about some rogue state that is outside the realms of the international community. We're talking about a country and a regime that is regarded and considered an ally of ours. Yet, they can so flagrantly undermine one of the pillars of democracy. Democracy is not about having an elections every 4 or 5 years. That's the very final point about a democracy. Democracy is about the institutions that preserve the rights of people to be equal, not just to feel equal, but to be equal. And without a proper, fair, independent judiciary, there can be no democracy. There can be no democracy. And that in itself is something which I have to say, upon reading the first and then final drafts of the report and the executive summary, I had to continuously remind myself that remarkably, Egypt, with the kind of judiciary that I'm reading about, is considered as an ally, a close ally of that, of our own state. Now the floor is yours. So those who wish to make a comment, make it very, very brief, please. And those who have questions, please point out to whom the question is directed. And before that, please mention your name, and if you represent a particular institution or media or the such, please also state that. If you can state your name and where you're from.
My name is Presa, I'm from Serbia. I have a question for Toby. So Toby, you mentioned that ICC cannot investigate Egypt because Egypt has not signed the Rome Statute. But my question is, do you think, how are the chances of referring the case to ICC by UN Security Council? Is it possible? Your opinion.
I'll happily answer that question.
Yes, yes, sir.
I want to know again from Mr. Toby
Yes.
about if there is any violations of human rights anywhere in the world, not only in Egypt or Iraq. Do the United Nations have any way of handling the human rights violations?
Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, so the first, I don't know whether to come to you, Ibrahim, or whether Drury, do you have any experience on? Although you said you're not an expert on Egypt, but the gentleman is correct that we're not. The time that we are at might be one of the most vicious times that modern Egypt has seen, but by no means is it sort of exclusive in terms of the various phases that came to Egypt. Egypt has seen, mass detentions, has seen torture, has seen executions, and the such before. So, in a sense, are we in a time where this is just back to normal, back to normal business, or is it a sort of an anomaly that we need to pay attention to simply because of the times that we live in?
Because as you rightly said, Anas, I'm not an expert, but a light reading of Egyptian history suggests that I don't think it is. I think it strikes me as considerably worse than what went before, and indeed even in the Mubarak or indeed Sadat period, or indeed even prior to the Nasser's revolution. It just is intensified, it seems to me, particularly post 2011, and exacerbated by, I think, some of the comments that you referred to, or some of the conditions of which you referred to in terms of political developments in the world, not least Trump. But I just want to address the other gentleman's question too, and it's the trouble that we all have with the United Nations in a way. The United Nations Human Rights Council now is United States withdrawal notwithstanding, there are some amazing work being done. Some of the cases in the reports are drawn from the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances. Hundreds of cases. Hundreds. Can they do anything? No. They can't. Not really. There's no UN army. So no one's going to step in and, do something. I do talks at schools and secondary schools, and it's such an obvious question. When people ask about Israel, Palestine, Iran, Iraq, Canada. I'm originally from Canada, and what Canada's done to Indigenous people. You can't. There's no force that's going to stop it. There's just us getting together and talking about it, and getting it onto the record, so there's something that we can, look back at, point to, produce some evidence, and hopefully change some people's minds. I'm afraid that's.
Carl, do you wanna-
I just wanted to make a couple of points. Yes, I agree entirely with you to a point that as much as the systems may have already been there, there have been times throughout history when Egypt has been a repressive and an oppressive state, and we look back to Mubarak, Sadat, etc. And then we look at, is this just reverting to type, effectively, and just gone back to how it always was? There is perhaps a degree of weight to the argument that it is, but I think we have to look in context of what the Tahrir Square uprising did. This is also contained in the other reports that we've written, also available on the Cordova website, and that's my sales pitch over. But if we look back through those reports, and if we look back to what happened after the Tahrir Square uprising and Mubarak going, abject fear amongst the army and the ruling classes. Now, the reason there is that much fear is because Egypt in particular, perhaps more so than any other country, the army has infiltrated every single level of state and the economy. And Egypt has, for decades, has been ruled by the army. Regardless of who's the figurehead and who's the position of power, it has been ruled by the army, and the army has got very, very rich off Egypt. So the fear that I refer to is the fear of the army, because when Morsi was elected, and let's not forget he was elected. Now, I don't seek to suggest that all of Morsi's policies were appropriate and that he was the perfect leader. I don't at all. But the salient point is that people voted the first democratic election in Egypt. It was internationally observed. Everybody said it was free and it was fair. There was no issue. So when we see Morsi coming to power, the army panic, because the army knows that Morsi will take away their power. He will take away their influence. And whether what he did was right or wrong, the army's influence was on the wane, as was the previous political classes. So I think that is why we see such a heavy crackdown in Egypt that we have not seen before. And it is no coincidence that it is being led by Sisi, an army officer. And I think we have to put it into that context and look at that as to why it is coming, the oppression of the Egyptian citizens is so savage. And I think that is the appropriate word. It is savage.
Thank you. ICC and the United Nations. Tony.
Well, I'll take the liberty of actually responding to three questions. One of the questions that was raised, which I'll deal with very, very briefly, was in relation to what Trump and Jared is doing, and the whole policy and effectively carving up Palestine. And I think it is deeply worrying. We worked on a matter a couple of years ago where we took a case against Egypt to the International Criminal Court, which is still under consideration, in relation to the Rafah border, which is highlighting some of the concerns that you've made, and the relationship between the Egyptian state and Israel in relation to closing that border and targeting Palestinians in Gaza. And we documented cases not only of individuals who were trying to get out because they were under bombardment, they had suffered injuries, but also because the Egyptian state was funneling salt water through the tunnels that was infecting the only natural water resources in Palestine. And because Palestine is a state party to the ICC has jurisdiction to investigate that and can investigate Egypt. But I think what you have focused on is a more disturbing pattern of the relationship between a number of different states and the future of Palestine. I think that is very, very disturbing. And I hope that certainly this year we see some action being taken by the ICC in that regard, because it needs to step up and do something. By the same token, because Egypt has not ratified the Rome Statute and there's no jurisdiction for crimes committed on Egyptian territory, the question is whether I think that there is any prospect of the UN Security Council referring the matter to the ICC, and I have to say no, absolutely no prospect. It is unfortunate that we are in that situation, that there is no prospect of it being referred. The
Is
last,
that because of jurisdiction, Toby, or is it about politics?
it's about politics. So there are only effectively two routes to go through. So if you're a state party and you've agreed to be bound by the Rome Statute and the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and taking the first report that we have responded to, taking it at its word, if they are so committed to the rule of law and international justice, then ratify the Rome Statute. What have you got to fear? If they are responding to terrorism, extremism, and everything that they've done is entirely justified, then they have nothing to fear from the International Criminal Court. But because they do have that to fear from the International Criminal Court, they will never ratify it. The only other way is through the UN Security Council. We've seen what's happened with Syria, we've seen what's happened with other jurisdictions, and unfortunately it's what happened in Libya that has had a determinative effect on other conflicts being referred to the ICC. And by the same token that Russia and China have consistently vetoed any UN Security Council referral of Syria to the International Criminal Court, we have to expect that you will have the same resistance from, certainly from Russia, and potentially from the United States as well. Because look, let's not forget that when the draft resolution was put before the UN Security Council in relation to the Syrian referral, and everybody talks about Russia and China, but let's not forget that the United States also were prepared to veto any referral if it included Golan Heights. So the United States does not come to the table with clean hands either. But it is a serious problem when the UN Security Council, which is the body that has the only power to deal with this, is effectively hamstrung. There is nothing that they can do. On the Syrian situation, all we had was a UN mechanism through the UN General Assembly because there is no power of veto. But it has no judicial authority. It has no ability to enter Syria to investigate. So we have to assume the same. As far as the UN and the powers of the UN, I completely agree with what Drury has said. There are mechanisms on the level of the Human Rights Council, there are special procedures, there are working groups, there are committees. The difficulty that you have is the Human Rights Council has become what I like to call the Eurovision Song Contest of international justice. You have states that stand side by side and will vote for each other, come what may. However, that said, the mechanism exists. It is important to use it, and Egypt was thoroughly criticized during their own human rights review when many of these issues were raised. The UN Human Rights Commissioner was very critical in the statements that have been issued, particularly in relation to the mass death penalty cases. So those mechanisms do exist, but it's not going to bring about immediate change. It's not going to result in anyone being prosecuted. And so for the only way that you're really going to establish any form of accountability, criminal accountability, is through universal jurisdiction in foreign states, in European countries. But you need to have the defendants, those that you're accusing, enter the jurisdiction in order to have them arrested.
Thank you very much. Anyone that wants to say anything, or yes, Ibrahim. Yes, introduce yourself, please, if you don't mind.
Ibrahim Alavi, I run an organization called the Syrian Legal Development Program. We work on Syria, also starting as a few block in November. My question goes to Ibrahim, and I'm not biased because we share the name, but in a few months back, I was in Geneva for the political talks on Syria, and I was with the head of the Syrian Civil Defense, which is a famous organization that brings people from under rubble, because it's an organization that we advise. And on the table, having lunch, the organization that helped organize our presence in Geneva had an Egyptian lady. And we were talking, and she was saying that Sisi uses Syria as an example of, do you want us to become like Syria? At that point, Ra'id, who is the head of the civil defense, he choked, he was eating, and he said, do you know that we tell each other, no matter from how much blood we've seen, that to kind of comfort each other, do you want to have, for what happened in Egypt to happen in Syria? We see chaos in Syria, at least at that time, as an opportunity to do something, not a complete, control alt-delete and just restarting the whole thing with a complete lockdown. Yes, more people have suffered, but there's still some sort of opportunity. Do you see a similar opportunity for Egypt as an Egyptian? Is there anything that someone can do within the system, or is it too late?
What a question. Of course, I really appreciate you asking that, because it's very important. I was trying to dodge questions, but again, no, don't worry about it. We used to always get that a lot when we were in prison by the guards themselves. We're keeping you here because we don't want Egypt to turn into like Syria, or this man saved Egypt from turning into Syria. Well, the fact, if you're watching or following the news, what's happening lately in Egypt, a lot of repression's happening, a lot of oppression's happening. Train ends up in a metro station somehow. People dying, children being killed and thrown on the streets, death sentences being given out. I always cover a topic when I'm speaking with politicians, is radicalization. If Sisi is manufacturing them right in his prisons, Egypt will somehow turn into Syria. Because for someone like me, I was just speaking with one of the brothers out there, that I was always looking forward to going to Ireland, to going home. These people are being released on bail. Some of them don't even get to see the streets. They go to the police station and there's a new case on their hands. And someone I lived personally with in a cell, he was tortured, and his wife was tortured naked in front of him. And he was banned from seeing his family, and 2 of his kids died while he was in prison. This man's not going to go out and ask for forgiveness, or tell someone to forgive them. So it's very difficult, because a lot of the people in prison in Egypt are youth. They went out with a simple, soft, clear heart that they just want to see and live like other countries are living. That they want to see a better country for themselves, that they want to see a better home for themselves, and yet they're being treated that way, without trial, without seeing their family, being tortured, being beaten, and disappearing for several months. Of course, that's not going to result to some sort of hope. I was speaking to one of the brothers again, telling him that it's very hard when you're speaking with these politicians in the UN, because they smile to you wearing a suit, pretending that like they're very helpful when they know what's going on, and they don't want to do anything. They really don't. And it's fighting for human rights is very, very difficult, especially when you're inside Egypt. And there is no journalist that can write from Egypt anymore without being arrested, or without being banned, or they're not even allowing to kick them out. So a lot still believe that maybe it could come from inside the army, because he's turning over a lot of his friends, like Subhi, where he turned against him, and we all thought Subhi was his right arm. So of course it's a political move, but still he's reaching a level where people will no longer be able to take it. It either explodes in his face, or it either turns into a war, and we are somehow rooting into that road that we don't want to see in the future for Egypt. So
Thank you, Ibrahim. Can I before I offer the final thanks, can I come to Dr. Maha Azzam, who's graced us with her presence today. Thank you very much, Maha, for coming. Usually, I have to say, you're usually sitting next to me on the panel, but if you can give us an insight of the report that you've seen and what you think of what you've heard today.
Thank you very much, Anas. First of all, I want to welcome the publication of this report about the breakdown in the rule of law and human rights in Egypt. It is an extremely important step to take, producing such reports. And although we've heard from the panelists that there are major legal challenges to prosecuting those who are responsible for crimes in Egypt, major problems regarding the role of the United Nations Security Council, and yet recording the truth, recording what's happened in legal terms, according to facts, exposing the regime is very important, not only internationally, but for Egyptians inside Egypt. The struggle for rights is a long struggle, and we all know that in the case of countries across the world. But meetings like this, work like this, is fundamental, a fundamental stepping stone in the direction of achieving such rights. And therefore I strongly welcome the report, and I hope we carry on, you carry on producing such reports. I think what is also clear is what is happening in Egypt is a complete breakdown in terms of the legal system and the rule of law. People speak about failed states. What we have in Egypt is a cornerstone of the state that has failed. The regime of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and the military state has failed, because ultimately it has used the institutions of the state, corrupted them, and uses them as a branch of its own power. They have become meaningless to the Egyptian citizen. This is why the struggle of the Egyptian people is not just to create chaos or to change things for the sake of it or to create revolution. It is in order to re-establish stability and security. That stability and security is important to Egypt. It's important to Egypt's allies regionally and internationally, and that needs to be recognized. The crimes that have happened in Egypt do constitute, or let me be legalistic about it, possibly constitute crimes against humanity. Whether what happened in Rab'a or the other massacres preceding Rab'a, or what happens on a daily basis in terms of the slow death of prisoners and the disappearances and so on and so forth. We have an elected president in prison, not allowed medication, being left to die a slow death. An elected president, along with thousands of others, and estimated over 40,000 political dissidents in Egypt's prisons. Let me say one last word about something that Toby Cadman mentioned, which is important. The issue of international jurisdiction, and it's one which I have used, having heard him once, more than once mention that this could be a possible channel. I have called through my organization, the Egyptian Revolutionary Council, for this to be used and understood by Egyptian citizens living abroad, and for them to get legal advice to see whether this international jurisdiction can be used against Egyptians who have committed crimes against Egyptian citizens traveling abroad, whether they be generals or politicians and so on. Just recently, the Egyptian so-called parliament of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi passed a law, obviously at his request, giving immunity to the top generals, giving them ministerial status so that they could have diplomatic immunity. I believe that is a response, primarily, not a message to the inside, but also that the generals are above the law. I think that is part of it. But I think another part of it is that they know they have committed crimes, and they want to have immunity when they travel abroad. So I think we need to look into that law and see how we can maneuver around it, given also, of course, that that parliament is illegitimate, but nevertheless, it is giving ministerial diplomatic status to generals so that they can travel to European capitals. Is there any way of working around that so that we can still have access to international jurisdiction? Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mahan. Thank you very much.
So the Egyptian state can, and the Egyptian parliament can adopt, ratify laws that give immunity. The point is whether that immunity would be recognized by a European court when you are talking about crimes such as torture. It's highly unlikely that any credible European state, European judge sitting in the national jurisdiction would uphold that. There were a number of different cases that were taken to the High Court in this country in respect of Egypt and Bahrain a few years ago, where claims of immunity were pleaded by these individuals for acts of torture. And the High Court recognized the principles under national and international law and held that they had no immunity without ruling on the substance of the allegations, but there was no immunity. The other point that I would say, quite often people look upon this as, this is a pipe dream, we're not actually ever going to get arrest warrants issued. And what I would say, if you look at the recent development in Germany, with the German federal prosecutor issuing an arrest warrant in relation to one of the most senior members of the Syrian military intelligence. When cases are properly put together and presented before judges in Germany, France, Spain, even here, action will be taken. But it's very, very important that you work on putting credible cases together based on credible evidence, and it will make a difference. The German case shows that you can actually go against some of the most senior members of the military intelligence, as we've seen now with the issuance of this first arrest warrant.
Thank you very much. Today was quite enlightening, and I think it exceeded most of our expectations. One or two of you actually called me earlier today saying, is it going to be something that we won't understand, legal language and jargon and such? If that's the case, then you have our blessings, do whatever you do, but we're not going to. One of you just texted me saying, thank God I came. I think that we've heard a very well-rounded discussion, a holistic, comprehensive discussion about this particular case. I would say that, and remind everyone that the full, as well as the executive summary, the full report and the executive summary are available on our website, thecordobafoundation.com. Please do download it, use it as you see fit, write to your MPs, write to the government, write to your human rights organization of choice. Remind them that of what's going on. Tell them about what you've heard today from Ibrahim, as well as from Drury, and what the cases that are entailed in the report itself. The recording of this session will also shortly be online for those of you who want to revisit and maybe pick up on some of the points. There's also a recording of some of our recent events and roundtable events and the like. A couple of months ago, we had a roundtable event concerning the Muslim Brotherhood and policies pertaining to the Muslim Brotherhood and the impacts and implications of those. That's available on our website for those of you who wish to revisit that. By all means, those of you who wish to take more copies of the executive report, they're outside for your pleasure, so take as many as you wish. I'd like to thank Dr. Abdullah Faliq. Abdullah, can you raise your hand, please? Abdullah is the managing director of the Cordoba Foundation. He's behind today the hall, the venue, the logistics, and everyone, and his team, Doina, and all the volunteers today. Thank you very, very much for your help and assistance and facilitating, making this event a success. Also, our brilliant designer who worked under immense pressure to work on the executive summary as well as the report itself, Dr. Abdullah Shaheen Khan. I would urge you all to look out for our future events. Hopefully, we'll be addressing many of the issues that came up today, including the deal of the century and many others that we'll be addressing, bringing experts together in order to talk about and discuss. And it's left for me to, on everyone's behalf, thank our fantastic panel for today. I'd like to thank our friends, authors, and the directors of the Guernica Group, Carl Buckley and Toby Cadman. Drury Dyke, thank you very, very much, and we look forward to having you again and again, because God knows that the issue of human rights abuses today is one of the most endemic problems that the world is suffering from. And last but not least, all the way from Dublin, and before that, all the way from Cairo. Ibrahim Halawa, thank you very much, Ibrahim, for coming to London and for being with us today. You have our best wishes and our prayers, and those to your colleagues and comrades and friends who still languish in prison. And finally, thank you to all of you for coming tonight. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.